The idea of the self-constituting citizen that's well endowed with rights and constrained by law has been indispensable to the forging of a stable democratic political system in America, legitimizing its institutions and ultimately birthing a cohesive nation that's bereft of the prerequisite of an underlying common ethnicity. And this principle has been the source of America's unprecedented success for over 2 centuries. In contrast, each time in recent history that the government have favored a group-based systemic solution, basically a despotism has followed, and ultimately the implosion of the state built upon it. And yet, this is where America's elite class seems hell bent on taking the nation. The past several decades have witnessed an implacable drive by our basically they've witnessed an implacable drive by our leadership class to make the group identity the dominant category in our thinking about in our thinking about and practice of politics, and few at the top seem to care about how the public really is, or are likely to respond to collectivist solutions that not only preference one group of people over another, but in effect it would bury once and for all the quintessentially American assertion that ultimately history can be redeemed not only by the individual but for its rest with the content of one's character and not on government action. The oligarchization of American elites and the parallel pauperization of the citizenry is the real but uniformly suppressed story behind the country's ongoing balkanization, while the preferred narrative has been that alleged racial and gender injustice must be overcome by executive fiat. The relative impoverishment of the American middle class has degraded the power of the citizenry to self-govern and has emboldened an increasingly detached elite to indulge in group-based political experiments with the re-engineering of the nation in accordance with ever-shifting notions of the equity and social justice in the ultimate goal. Just before the COVID pandemic hit, almost one-third of all Americans lived in lower-class households with a median income of just over $25,000 a year, less than two-thirds of the national median. In 2015, the number of middle-class households dipped below 50%. With the lockdowns destroying small businesses, it continues to spiral downward. In contrast, to the 1950s, two-thirds of American households were comfortably middle class. But most importantly, while barely half of all households today belong to the middle class, according to Pew, already in 2014, the gap between the earnings of middle income and upper income classes was the widest ever recorded in American history. The fading of the middle class has been the predictable byproduct of the corporate offshoring of our industry and has diminished its influence, a trend accelerated by the persistent disavowal of its values and lifestyles by our nation's opinion makers. In a nation where 80% of the population has seen its relative economic position decline, and with it, its ability to influence the country's politics increasingly marginalized, the ruling oligarchies' continued disregard for their concerns, values, and preferences is a prescription for deepening polarization, political instability, and further unrest. The collectivism, in any guise, including its postmodern, what they call progressivist variety, has been historically anti-ethical to a free society, and for it ultimately disempowers and muzzles the individual. The foundational assumption of Marxism has been its preference for group categories as the building blocks of society, and in an all-out rejection of the post-Enlightenment and quintessentially American ideal of the self-constituting individual. This radical disavowal of the free citizen is in favor of class categories, and it was captured by Lenin's devotee, Vladimir Mayakovsky, when he declared that the individual human being was an irrelevance in the modern world, for only the proletariat organized for action by the Communist Party could achieve social justice for all. And to this day, Marxist social engineers worldwide recoil from the notion that an individual can make sovereign personal choices and remain empowered by law to shape his or her life, and such a self-constituting citizen, and by extension society, directly contradicts the immutable laws of progress that, in the view of the collectivists, have chartered the course of history. But what makes America's flirtation with collectivism striking is that race and gender, rather than class, have become the dominant mode of discourse about group grievance and blindness to the more prosaic reality of what is driving the fracturing of the American nation. For years, Americans have been indoctrinated in their schools and universities and conditioned through the media that they consume, and to look at one another not as a member of a community of self-reliant, but citizens bound together by a commitment to the individual freedom under the law, and a shared national identity and mutual obligation, but increasingly as a collection of aggrieved groups, each validated by its own grievance, real or imagined, and poised to exact retribution for the misdeeds of generations past. Today, the process of racializing of American history has nearly reached its climax. We are poised to begin to decompose as a nation along geo-ideological lines, and reflecting the territorial alignment of exclusive ideologies, or to witness the triumph of the American left over progressively disenfranchised citizenry. If the decline is not stopped soon, the final outcome is likely to repeat the experience of other nations that at some point in their history had veered in the direction of a group-based social engineering as a pathway to allegedly more just to an allegedly more just society. No one can predict how the abandonment of the American ideal of the individual citizens' rights under the law will ultimately play out, but one thing is certain: when rhetoric and reality fundamentally align, chaos reigns.